They came when the world was already dying. We were still here. The road into what used to be Stavanger was a graveyard of axles and ambitions. Marcus Hale counted burned-out vehicles the way other men counted heartbeats, as evidence of continued survival, proof that time had not yet run out. 22 on the stretch from the coast road to the old bridge. 22 decisions that ended badly. 22 families who got out or didn't. 22 engines that stopped and never started again. He'd been counting that particular stretch for 3 years, ever since he and Lena had found the island and decided it was worth keeping. The morning was gray in that particular Scandinavian way that wasn't threatening, just honest. The clouds sat low enough to taste, salt-heavy, the sea wind pushing in from the west, with a faint chemical bite underneath it that you only noticed if you'd been breathing cleaner air. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. He'd worked environmental monitoring before the Keth arrived, had spent a decade measuring what humans were doing to their own air, and now the irony was that the worst contamination wasn't theirs at all. He crouched at the waterline below the bridge, rifle across his knees, and watched the far shore. Nothing moving. 3 cormorants stood on a half-submerged guardrail, 40 meters out, perfectly still, which meant nothing larger was moving out there either. Animals had better threat detection than any scope he owned. He'd learned that the 3rd month, after a Keth patrol had passed within 200 meters of their position, and the cormorants hadn't even flinched. The Keth smelled like ozone and hot iron, like the inside of a circuit board. Birds hated that smell. When the birds went still and watchful, you didn't need anything else. He waited 6 minutes by the mechanical watch on his left wrist. Battery-operated devices attracted the Keths. Proximity sensors then rose and crossed the bridge at a controlled jog, staying low, boots quiet on the cracked asphalt. The pack on his back held 40 liters of capacity, and he'd filled maybe 12 of it. Medical tape, 3 cans of food, a box of ammunition, a hand-drawn map of the hospital complex on the mainland's southern edge. That last item had taken him 4 days to compile from memory and from a pamphlet he'd found in the ruins of a pharmacy. The hospital was the reason he was here. Lena needed antibiotics, the real kind. The kind that actually worked on the infection that had taken hold in her left leg after the cut she'd gotten crossing the wire fence behind the old school. He'd cleaned it, stitched it, kept it elevated. But the red lines were climbing past her knee now, and his cleaning and stitching and elevation were not going to be enough. Some problems were beyond a father's love to solve. Some problems needed medicine. He thought about telling her the lines weren't that bad. He'd considered it seriously. Standing over her bunk the previous morning while she slept, watching the red track the vein up toward her thigh, he could tell her it was fine. She'd probably believe him for another day or two. She trusted him with the kind of absolute faith that only the very young can manage. Not because she was naive. Lena was 17 and had seen enough to strip most adults of their illusions, but because he had not lied to her yet. Not about the things that mattered. Lying now would spend something he couldn't afford to spend. So here he was on the mainland, breathing contaminated air, watching cormorants. The hospital was 4 kilometers from the bridge, through what had been a residential district, and was now something harder to name. The houses were still standing mostly. The Keth didn't tear things down the way an invading human army might. They weren't interested in territory in any way Marcus had yet understood, weren't interested in resources or infrastructure, beyond the energy columns they'd planted along the coast, and the transit corridors they kept moving through. They were interested in something else, some accounting he couldn't read, some calculation being run on a scale he couldn't perceive. They'd taken half the Northern Hemisphere in 8 months, and then just stopped. Stopped advancing, stopped retreating, sat in their positions like chess pieces mid-game, and the humans left alive had slowly, carefully begun to build lives in the spaces between them. Marcus moved through the residential district using the backyards, over fences, and through gates, keeping the houses between himself and the main road. Old habit, old discipline. He'd taught Lena to move this way from her first week on the island, had drilled her until she could cross 200 meters of open ground without ever being in the open. She'd complained bitterly, the way teenagers will, but she'd learned. He was starting to suspect that most of what he'd given her was things she'd complained about, learning, and would use for the rest of her life. The Keth patrol schedule in this sector ran on an 8-hour rotation, and Marcus had spent 3 weeks watching the pattern before he trusted it enough to enter. The mathematics weren't perfect. The Keth could vary their routes, had done it twice in his observation period, randomly enough to suggest the variation was intentional, but the general window was reliable. He had roughly 4 hours before the next sweep. He found the hospital at 20 minutes past 7 in the morning. It was a 5-story building in that particular institutional architecture that hospitals the world over seemed to share, as if illness were an international language, and the buildings that housed it had to look the same in every language. The ground floor windows were boarded or broken. The main entrance doors had been welded shut. He could see the torch marks on the frame, which was interesting. Somebody had been here after the first wave, somebody with tools and some sense of organization. That could mean others were using this place as a resource, which meant potential allies or potential danger, and in Marcus's experience, the two were often the same thing. He went around the east side to the loading dock, found the metal door there chained, but not welded, picked the padlock in under 4 minutes using a tool he'd fashioned from a bicycle spoke and a bent nail, and slipped inside. The smell hit first. Disinfectant faded to ghost memory. Underneath it, the iron-copper smell of old blood. Underneath that, something organic and deep that he identified after a moment as mold. The corridor was dark, except for emergency lighting that had somehow maintained a trickle of charge. Solar panel on the roof, maybe, or a hand crank system somewhere, and the light was the color of old teeth. Enough to see by and nothing more. He had the map. He knew the hospital's layout from it, knew that the pharmacy would be on the second floor near the nurse's station, and he moved toward the stairwell with his rifle up and his breathing controlled, the way he'd been trained in a previous life that felt like someone else's story. He was on the second floor landing when he heard the boy. Not a voice. The boy wasn't making any sound at all, which was part of what made Marcus stop and stay very still. What he heard was the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard. A suppressed breath, the minimal friction of cloth against a wall, the particular quality of occupied silence that is different from empty silence in ways you can only describe as instinct. Marcus had been paying attention to that quality for years now. He waited. The boy appeared from behind the nurse's station counter 15 seconds later, moving in a low crouch, heading for the pharmacy door. He was perhaps 15 or 16, thin in a way that suggested sustained deprivation rather than natural build, wearing clothes that had been repaired so many times they were more repair than original fabric. Dark hair, dark eyes when they found Marcus, and he froze the way a deer freezes. Not from stupidity, but from the very rational understanding that motion might be what kills you. They stared at each other across 12 feet of dim corridor. Marcus lowered his rifle slowly, barrel toward the floor. The boy didn't move. Marcus held up his left hand, open palm. The boy didn't move. Marcus said very quietly, "I'm not going to hurt you." And the boy's expression shifted in a way that Marcus took a moment to read correctly. Not relief, not suspicion, but something more puzzling. A sort of regret or resignation. The boy opened his mouth and no sound came out. Not a choice, Marcus understood after a moment. Not silence as strategy. The boy was mute. He pointed at himself. The boy watched. Marcus touched his own throat. Shook his head once, the universal shorthand for "I know you can't." And the boy's expression shifted again, this time towards something that might have been gratitude. If gratitude could be expressed in the set of a jaw and the adjustment of weight from one foot to the other. They went into the pharmacy together. Marcus found the antibiotics in the third cabinet he searched. Amoxicillin, a broad-spectrum option. Not ideal, but far better than nothing, and enough of it to run a full course twice over. He filled one of the pharmacy's small paper bags with the bottles and put it in his pack. The boy was on the other side of the room, methodically going through a drawer of sterile bandages and wound dressings, stuffing them into a bag of his own with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Smart kid, taking what actually worked, not what looked valuable. Marcus watched him for a moment, then said quietly, "Is there anyone waiting for you?" The boy looked up, shook his head. "Where are you sleeping?" The boy's eyes went to the window, toward the east, which could mean anything from 2 blocks away to another city. Marcus thought about it. He thought about the mathematics of survival, which he'd been running for 3 years, and which always came back to the same answer. More minds are safer than fewer. More sets of hands see more things, and the people who tried to survive alone died faster. He'd seen it enough times to stop doubting it. He thought about Lena, who had been talking to herself for the last month, because there was nobody else to talk to on the island except her father, and who deserved better than that. He thought about the boy's face when Marcus had acknowledged the muteness, the regret, the resignation, and understood that this was someone who had been left behind before. "I have a place," Marcus said. "There's room." The boy went very still. Then, carefully, he pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and a stub of pencil, and wrote something, and held it up. "Why?" "Because you're useful," Marcus said, which was true but not the whole truth. And from the way the boy looked at him, it was possible he understood that. "And because you shouldn't be alone." The boy held the notebook a moment longer, then put it away. They left the hospital together, moving through the residential district in the way Marcus had come, and the boy, who Marcus was already thinking of as the boy, not as a stranger, not as a problem, moved quietly and well, stayed close without crowding, matched Marcus's pace and route choices without needing to be directed. He'd been doing this for a while. He knew how to move in the world that remained. They were 3 blocks from the bridge when the Keth appeared. It came from the north, emerging from behind a church at the end of the street, and Marcus's first sight of it was the light it cast. The faint blue-white luminescence that preceded their physical form by several meters, bioluminescent or electromagnetic or both. The scientist who'd studied it before the networks went down had argued about the mechanism. Marcus didn't care about the mechanism. He cared that it was there and that it was between them and the bridge. He pulled the boy back into the doorway of a house without thinking, one hand on the boy's collar, and they pressed into the shadow and went absolutely still. The Keth moved down the center of the street at its characteristic pace, that flowing, asymmetric gait that no human biomechanics expert had ever produced a satisfying explanation for. It was roughly humanoid in the way that an approximation is humanoid. 2 upright supports, bilateral symmetry, something serving the function of a head, but the proportions were wrong in ways that hit the brain's pattern recognition centers like a skipped heartbeat. 3 meters tall, joints that bent in more directions than joints should, a skin surface that was the color of old pewter, and moved in slow convections like cooling metal. The boy didn't make a sound. He'd pressed himself flat against the door, and Marcus could feel the boy's pulse through the hand still on his collar. Fast, very fast, but controlled. Not panic. Fear, which was different. Fear was rational. Fear meant you were paying attention. The Keth paused in the middle of the street. Marcus had seen this behavior before. They would stop, sometimes for seconds, sometimes for minutes. The bioluminescence pulsing in slow waves, the head analog tilting. He'd never been certain whether they detected up something specific or were just running some internal calibration. He'd never stayed still long enough afterward to find out. The Keth turned its head analog slowly through a full 180-degree arc. The light intensified briefly. Marcus felt the fine hair on his arms stand up and stayed absolutely still, and breathed through his nose in the quietest rhythm he could manage. The boy did something unexpected then. He reached slowly into his bag. Marcus fought every instinct not to grab his wrist, and pulled out a small piece of reflective material, the kind used in emergency blankets, and held it carefully angled. The Keth's bioluminescent pulse hit it and scattered in a dozen directions, not toward them. The boy held it steady with a steady hand and did not move anything else. The Keth's light dimmed slightly. The head analog returned to forward position. After another 20 seconds, it resumed its movement down the street, and the light faded, and the cormorants on a nearby ledge ruffled their feathers and went still again. Marcus waited 3 minutes, then let out a breath. He looked at the boy looked back. Marcus said nothing for a moment, then, "Where did you learn that?" The boy shrugged, got out his notebook, wrote, "Trial and error, how many errors?" The boy thought about it, then held up 2 fingers and made a so-so gesture with his other hand. Marcus processed this. "You've had 2 encounters and survived both." The boy nodded. "The reflective surface works because it disrupts their luminescent feedback loop. They use it for spatial mapping. Scatter the echo and they can't locate the source." The boy pointed at Marcus with an expression that suggested he was supposed to continue. "I read it in a paper," Marcus said, "before the network went down. Some physicist in Trondheim who had 12 hours of data before his station was destroyed. I don't know if the physics was right, but apparently it works." The boy wrote, "You read physics papers." "I read everything," Marcus said. "Everything I could get. It's the only advantage we have." They crossed the bridge and reached the boat an hour later. It was a small aluminum hull Marcus had taken from a marina in the first month, flat-bottomed, maneuverable, with a motor he'd converted to run on a biodiesel compound he'd figured out from a manual found in a farm supply store. Noisy but effective. He'd wrapped the hull in a radar-absorbing material salvaged from a military's installation near Bergen, though whether the Keth used anything resembling radar he still wasn't certain. The boy sat in the bow and watched the water and said nothing, which was all he could do, but there was nothing vacant in his watching. He was cataloging, Marcus thought, adding this crossing to an internal map. Lena was sitting on the dock when they arrived. She was supposed to be in the house. Marcus had been very clear about staying in the house when he was on the mainland, had explained the reasons patiently and repeatedly, and here she was on the dock with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her legs stretched out in front of her and an expression that suggested She had decided that the rule about staying in the house was, in this specific instance, outweighed by her need to know immediately whether her father had returned. She looked at the boy in the bow, and then at her father with an expression that said many things simultaneously, the primary ones being, "Who is that, and why didn't you tell me? And also, I'm not moving from this dock until you explain everything." "His name," Marcus said, stepping onto the dock and reaching back to tie off the bowline, "is still something we're working on. He can't speak. He's going to stay with us for a while." Lena's eyes moved from her father to the boy, who was climbing out of the boat with the careful deliberateness of someone not entirely sure of their welcome, and something in her expression shifted. The suspicion softened, not gone but relocated, moved to the back of the shelf. "For how long?" she said. "That's to be decided." "Does he have a name?" Marcus looked at the boy. The boy got out his notebook, wrote something, held it up so Lena could see. "Kai, Kai," Lena said, as if testing the weight of it. Then she looked at the legs she had stretched out in front of her. The bandaging Marcus could see was damp through, and said, "Did you find the antibiotics?" "Yes." "Are they the right kind?" "They're a kind. They'll work." She exhaled, and the exhale held 3 years of keeping herself together, of being 17 in a world designed for nobody's convenience and certainly not for teenagers who'd been promised something different. Then she looked at Kai again, this time with something less guarded, something almost. Not warm, not yet, but oriented toward warmth the way a plant orients toward light even before the light is there. "He can have the spare bunk," she said, "but he has to do chores." Kai wrote in his notebook and held it up. "What kind of chores?" "The kind everyone has to do," Lena said, which was the beginning of something, though none of them knew yet what it would become. The island was 4 hectares, which sounded large and wasn't, particularly when you needed to stay off the northern shore because it faced the mainland patrol corridor, and off the western shore because the rocks, there were loud and noise-traveled. The livable portion was perhaps 1 hectare. The old farmhouse, the outbuildings, the south-facing slope that got enough light to grow the root vegetables that made up most of their diet, the stream that ran along the east edge and was clean enough to drink with treatment. Marcus had chosen it for its defensibility and its invisibility. The farmhouse sat in a depression in the terrain that made it nearly invisible from the water. The vegetation had grown up thick around it in the years of abandonment, and he'd added to the concealment deliberately, letting certain shrubs grow, cutting others, arranging the sight lines so that a Keth patrol passing on the water would see forest and rock and nothing else. It had worked for 3 years. He didn't know if it would work forever. He suspected nothing worked forever. But 3 years was longer than many people had managed, and he'd take it. Kai found his place in the rhythms of the island the way water finds its level, not by forcing anything, but by filling the available space. He was useful in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. He knew plants, could identify edibles in the hedgerows that Marcus had been stepping around for 3 years without recognizing as food. He knew machinery in a practical, hands-in-the-components way, and within a week he'd improved the efficiency of the biodiesel motor by approximately 30% through adjustments Marcus wouldn't have known to make. He didn't need instructions for most things. He'd watch something done once, and then do it himself, sometimes better. He and Lena communicated in a way that Marcus watched with a kind of quiet amazement. She'd learned his notebook system within 2 days, had invented shorthand with him by the end of the first week, and was writing him rapid-fire half-sentences that he answered in kind while Marcus was still trying to parse the first exchange. They argued. He could tell from the speed of the writing and the expressions, the way Lena would set her jaw, and Kai would tilt his head with something that was clearly exasperation. They argued about small things, about the order of tasks and the best way to seal the gap in the eastern outbuilding wall, and whether a particular root vegetable was ready to harvest. Normal arguments, the kind that only happen between people who are already comfortable with each other. Marcus sat with that comfort in the evenings, sitting on the south-facing slope with the last light of the day and a mug of something that was technically tea if you were generous with definitions, and watched his daughter argue with a mute boy about root vegetables, and felt something move in him that had been frozen for a long time. It was the 3rd evening when he told them about the Keth. Not the basics. They both knew the basics. Everyone alive knew the basics. But what he'd learned in the years of watching and reading and staying alive while the world contracted. He spread his notes on the kitchen table, which had been a farmer's kitchen table, and had the weight and solidity of something built to last. And he talked while Kai read, and Lena sat cross-legged on her chair, the way she'd sat, since she was small enough to have it look natural. "They don't communicate the way we do," Marcus said. We've established that. The sounds they make aren't language in any sense that maps onto our models, but they do communicate. We know that because the patrols coordinate, because the energy columns maintain synchronized pulse rates, because when one of them is destroyed, the response is patterned, not random. They're talking, we just can't hear it. Kai wrote, they use the light. That's one hypothesis. The bioluminescent patterns carry information. Some researchers thought it was more complex than that the electromagnetic field they generate is itself the communication medium, that what we see as light is just the overflow. The way you can sometimes see the corona of a signal, even when the signal itself is invisible. Lena was looking at her leg. The redness had begun to recede in the 2 days she'd been on antibiotics, the lines retreating the way a tide retreats, and Marcus had been watching it with the kind of relief that lives close to its inverse. What do they want? She said. It was the question everyone had been asking, since the first Keth vessel appeared over the Norwegian Sea, and the scrambled military response had lasted approximately 6 hours before the world revised its understanding of what military responses were capable of accomplishing. I don't know, Marcus said. Nobody knows. I have theories, Kai wrote. Tell us. The energy columns are the key. They're planted along geomagnetic fault lines, every single one of them, without exception. They're not taking our resources. They're not occupying our territory the way a conventional invader would. They're taking something from the planet itself, from the field, from whatever it is that makes this rock generate the electromagnetic environment it does. He paused. They might be harvesting something we don't even have a name for, a property of planetary geomagnetics that we haven't discovered, because we haven't needed to. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, so they're not here for us. I don't think we're the target. I think we're incidental. He chose the next words carefully, which is in its way more terrifying than being the target. A predator that wants you can be negotiated with, fled from killed. An entity that doesn't notice you can step on you the way you step on grass. Kai had been writing while Marcus talked. He held up the notebook now. The reflective material. Is there a way to use it offensively? Marcus looked at him. What do you mean? Kai wrote for longer this time, filling most of a page. His handwriting was small and precise, and when he held it up, Marcus read it twice to make sure he'd understood. If their luminescent field is their communication medium and their spatial mapping system, then disrupting it isn't just concealment, it's interference. A large enough disruption, coordinated enough, might not just hide you from one patrol, it might create a dead zone in their field, like cutting a nerve. And if the energy columns run on the same medium, if the columns are nodes in the same network, then a localized disruption near a column might not just interrupt one column. It might propagate through the network, the way a spike propagates through a power grid. Marcus read it again. Then he looked at Kai for a long time. You're talking about a countermeasure, Marcus said, slowly. Something that doesn't require weapons, doesn't require force against something we don't have the force to use force against. Kai nodded. How long have you been thinking about this? Kai held up 4 fingers, then on further thought added a 5th. 5 months. Another nod. By yourself. Kai made the so-so gesture with his hand. He tapped his temple, then gestured outward. He'd been thinking, but thinking with what he'd learned from other people, from observation, from the pattern of 3 years of survival. Lena had been listening. Now she said we'd need more of the material, a lot more. Where would we get it? This was the question that kept Marcus lying awake in the dark for the next 4 nights. The military installation near Bergen, the one he'd taken the radar-absorbing material from, had been a substantial facility before the Keth overran it. He'd been inside twice, both times in the earliest months when the risk calculus had been different because the Keth hadn't yet established their patrol patterns and their presence was still chaotic. He'd taken what he'd needed and left. But he'd seen, in those visits, a warehouse section he hadn't entered because he didn't have the tools to break the lock and didn't need what was behind it badly enough at the time to improvise. He needed it now. On the 5th night, he explained the plan. Not a raid, he disliked that word's implications, the cowboy film momentum it carried. A retrieval. Careful, patient, mapped in advance, with multiple exit routes and abort criteria defined before they started. Lena said, I'm coming. You're on antibiotics. I've been on antibiotics for 5 days. The infection is clearing. I'm coming. Your leg is fine. I'm coming. Marcus looked at her and recognized the particular quality of this decision. It had already been made, and the conversation they were having was a courtesy he was offering, and she was accepting while changing nothing. She'd become this in the last year, this certain, not reckless. She'd never been reckless, but the uncertainty she'd carried for the first 2 years The constant checking of his face to know how afraid to be had been replaced by something more settled. She'd made her own calculations now. He wasn't sure when it had happened. He was sure it was right. Fine, he said. You navigate. I carry. Kai. Kai was already writing. He held up the notebook. I know the installation. Everyone went still. You've been there? Marcus said. Kai nodded. Recently? Kai wrote, 6 weeks ago, and before that. I know where the material is stored. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room and changes its shape. Marcus looked at his daughter. His daughter looked at Kai. Kai looked at neither of them, was writing something else, and when he held it up, it said, I came to the island because I needed the antibiotic for myself. Not for a plan. I had no plan then. And now, Lena said. Kai's expression was, for the first time since Marcus had known him, entirely unguarded. The notebook lowered. The habitual careful watchfulness dropped in a way that made him look exactly his age, which was young, which was younger than anyone should have to be doing this. He held up the notebook one more time. Now I have people. They left before dawn 3 days later, all 3 of them in the aluminum hull, crossing the black water with the motor running quiet on Marcus's biodiesel, and the stars overhead doing what stars do, which is persist regardless of what happens below them. Lena sat in the stern. Kai sat in the bow where Marcus had first seen him, and Marcus ran the motor in the center, navigating by the mechanical compass and the coastline landmarks he'd memorized in the first year when memorization had been survival and not a hobby. The installation was 40 kilometers north along the coast. They made it in 2.5 hours, beached the boat on the shingle below the cliff that fronted the facility, and went up the slope in single file. Marcus first, Kai second, Lena third, moving in the way Marcus had trained both of them to move now, low, quiet, deliberate, using the ground's contours and the vegetation for cover. The installation was quieter than it had been 3 years ago. In those first months, there had still been fires, still been bodies, still been the particular atmospheric quality of recent catastrophe, which is a combination of smell and light and sound that you don't forget once you've registered it. Now it was just ruins, old enough to have been colonized by weeds and weather, which gave it a different quality. Not the immediacy of disaster, but the permanence of aftermath. The way history looks when it's finished happening. Kai led them to a side entrance Marcus hadn't found in his previous visits. A ventilation shaft, covered by a grating that Kai removed with practiced ease from having done it before, and they went through in a crawl that was uncomfortable for Marcus. He was not a small man, and came out in a service corridor that smelled of rust and old air. Kai navigated by memory. He moved through the dark corridors with his hand trailing the wall, making small directional gestures with his other hand that Marcus and Lena followed without difficulty, the shorthand of movement made into a language. 3 lefts, a staircase down, a right, through a fire door that moved silently on hinges Kai had apparently oiled on a previous visit. The warehouse was behind a roll-up metal door that was padlocked, and this time Marcus had the tools he needed. The lock was open in 3 minutes. The door went up without sound, also oiled, also prepared, and inside was the smell of synthetic materials and industrial storage and something. Underneath both of those that Marcus identified, after a moment as ozone, a familiar smell, a Keth smell, they all stopped. They've been here, Lena said very quietly. Marcus swept the interior with his flashlight. Long metal shelving, industrial materials under canvas wraps, wooden crates stacked to the ceiling in the far corner, and in the center of the floor, unmissable now that the light found it, a depression approximately 2 meters in diameter where the concrete had been slowly liquefying. Not from heat, but from the Keith's proximity effect, the electromagnetic field interaction that degraded certain materials. He'd read about it. He'd read about everything. They had been here. They came periodically, maybe to the installation specifically, maybe on a route that passed through it. That changed the math. He looked at Kai. Kai was already moving to the shelving, pulling canvas wraps aside with the efficiency of someone who knew what they were looking for and where it was. He found it in the 3rd row, bundles of the radar-absorbing composite material, vacuum-sealed in heavy plastic bags, a quantity that Marcus estimated at several hundred kilograms. Enough, more than enough, if his calculations were right. If Kai's calculations were right, which Marcus was increasingly certain they were. They worked fast but quiet, loading the material into the duffel bags they'd brought, moving between the shelving and the door, with the smooth coordination of people who'd spent 3 weeks living in close quarters and had learned each other's rhythms. Marcus carried the most, because he was the strongest. Lena moved the bags to the corridor. Kai selected, sorted, identified the specific grades of material that were optimal for their purpose. They were on the 4th load when Lena hissed a single syllable from the corridor. The warning sound Marcus had taught her, the one that meant stop immediately. They stopped. The light came first, through the ventilation gaps at ceiling level, that blue-white pulse, barely perceptible against the darkness outside, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Marcus pressed himself against the shelving and held his breath, and felt Kai do the same a meter to his right. The Keth patrol passed along the exterior of the building. The light pulsed, intensified, passed. Marcus counted 60 seconds, then another 60. Kai touched his sleeve and pointed down. The ozone smell in the room had intensified, and the concrete depression in the center of the floor was emitting a faint light of its own, responding to the Keth's proximity, some kind of resonance effect, like metal warming near a magnet. They finished the fourth load and moved, not because they had everything they needed, but because the visit had changed something about the risk calculus, and Marcus was not going to spend his daughter's life on extra margins. They had enough. Enough was the standard, always. The crawl, back through the ventilation shaft with loaded duffel bags, was the least pleasant 20 minutes Marcus had experienced recently, and he'd experienced some genuinely unpleasant ones. They made it to the surface with the bags, and moved to the boat, and got it off the shingle with the water already at their ankles, cold enough to numb sensation in seconds, and crossed the water back south in the dark, with the load shifting in the hull, and the stars still persisting, and the horizon ahead of them, beginning to soften from black to gray. Nobody spoke on the crossing, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was doing its own work, holding things together that had been under pressure, allowing the adrenaline to metabolize and the hands to stop shaking and the mind to begin the transition from acute crisis to the next problem. The next problem was the energy column. There was one 17 kilometers north of the island, which they'd known about from the first month. It sat on a rocky headland, roughly 4 meters tall, a featureless column of the same pewter gray material as the Keth themselves, emitting a low-frequency pulse that Marcus could feel in his back teeth if the wind was right. He'd studied it from the water, from the shore, from every angle he could achieve safely. He'd drawn diagrams of it in his notebook. He'd noted the pulse intervals and the color variations in its faint luminescence and the way it responded, or didn't, to various stimuli, including the approach of human beings, which it did not appear to respond to at all. Kai's theory, which Marcus had been testing against everything he knew and found he could not refute, was this. The columns were nodes in the Keth's communication and navigation network, which used the same bioluminescent electromagnetic medium as the Keth themselves. They were antennas, effectively, and antennas could be jammed. The reflective composite material, deployed in sufficient quantity around the base of a column, would scatter the electromagnetic field in every direction simultaneously. Not block it. Blocking required mass and density the material didn't have, but scatter it, diffract it, turn it into reference with itself. The column would still pulse, but the information in the pulse would become noise. And if the information became noise in one node, what happened to the network? That was the question Marcus had been wrestling with for 9 days. The physicist in Trondheim had died before he could answer it. Every research paper Marcus had read in the years before the network went down had been theoretical, had been predicated on assumptions about the Keth's communication system that were educated guesses at best. He'd shared his uncertainty with Kai. Kai had written that is why we try one column first. Then we see what happens, which was, Marcus had to acknowledge, a perfectly reasonable scientific approach. You ran the experiment, you observed the result, you revised your model. They spent 8 days preparing. Marcus built the deployment frames from materials on the island, lightweight structures that would hold the reflective composite at the optimal angles Kai had calculated, creating the maximum diffraction effect. Lena handled the calculations, which turned out to involve more applied physics than Marcus had expected, and which she absorbed from his notes and from her own working through with a speed that confirmed something he'd suspected for a while. She was significantly more intelligent than her education had been allowed to demonstrate. Kai built the trigger mechanism, which was the part Marcus would not have thought of, which was typical of Kai. The composite material worked passively. You didn't need to activate it, but it needed to be deployed around the column simultaneously, all sections at once, or the Keth would have a second to respond before the full diffraction effect was achieved. Kai's mechanism was elegant, a series of tensioned frames connected to a central release, spring-loaded, that would deploy all sections in under a second, from a single trigger pull 40 meters from the column. They rehearsed the deployment on the island with dummy frames, running it until all 3 of them could execute their parts in darkness, in wind, In the silence, that was the permanent condition of one of them. The night they chose was moonless, and the wind was from the southwest, which was the direction that put the mainland patrol corridor behind them, and the open sea ahead. Marcus had watched the patrol schedule around the headland specifically for 2 weeks, and was as certain as he could be about the window. They would have 40 minutes. The deployment would take 4 if everything went right. 36 minutes of margin, which was a lot more than they usually had. They landed on the headland at midnight. The column was taller up close than it looked from the water. The pulse was a physical thing, not a sound exactly, more a pressure, a rhythmic compression in the air that you felt behind the eyes and in the chest. Lena reached out once, involuntarily, toward its surface, and Kai caught her wrist without looking, gently but firmly, and she pulled her hand back. Right, she said very quietly. I knew that. They set the frames. Marcus on the north side, Lena on the south, Kai threading the trigger line between them in the dark, moving by feel and memory. It went smoothly, in the way things go smoothly when you've rehearsed so much that your body knows the movements, and your conscious mind free to watch the perimeter. Marcus found the anchor points, set the frames, locked them down. Lena did the same on her side. Kai ran the trigger line to the release point 40 meters back and checked the tension twice, then gave the signal. A single touch on Marcus's hand. They withdrew to the trigger point together. Marcus looked at his daughter in the dark, which was the kind of looking you do when you're not sure of what comes next and want to record this moment precisely before it changes. She looked back with the directness she'd developed, the particular quality of young people who've been through something that makes them meet your eyes all the way instead of glancing away. He looked at Kai, who was standing very still with the trigger in his hand, and who was looking at the column with an expression Marcus had learned to read, not resolve, exactly. Not the dramatic tightening of jaw that films would put in this moment. Something quieter. The expression of someone who has been working on a problem alone for 5 months and is about to find out if they were right. Marcus nodded once. Kai pulled the trigger. The frames deployed in the instant of a breath, a sound like a large book slamming closed, multiplied by 12, and the composite panels opened around the base of the column like petals of a mechanical flower, angled at the precise geometries Kai had calculated. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the column's pulse stuttered. Marcus had never seen it stutter. In 2 years of observation, it had pulsed with the absolute regularity of a machine designed by something that did not make mistakes. The stutter was a single missed beat, like a heart arrhythmia, and then another, and then the luminescence changed. The steady blue-white going uncertain, flaring and dimming in a pattern that was clearly not intentional, the information content of the pulse becoming what it looked like. Interference, feedback, noise. It's working, Lena breathed. It was working. What happened next took 40 seconds and would take Marcus months to understand fully. The pulse irregularity didn't stay local. It propagated. The column was a node in a network, and the noise they'd introduced into its output was traveling through that network at whatever speed the Keth's electromagnetic medium operated. Fast, very fast, and 17 kilometers to the south and 12 kilometers to the east, and somewhere far up the coast they couldn't see. Other columns were receiving that noise and adding their own responses, and the network was doing what networks do when a signal goes wrong. It was trying to correct. The correction was visible in the sky. Not visible directly, not the kind of thing you'd see if you weren't looking for it. Didn't know what the columns looked like when they were operating normally. But Marcus had spent 2 years looking at these things, had cataloged every variation in their output, and what was happening in the sky above the headland and in the direction of the other columns was not normal operation. The aurora-like effects that the column sometimes produced were firing rapidly, erratically, and in the wrong colors, or rather in the right colors mixed into noise. The way signal strength dropping into static will produce a brief cacophony of every channel at once. The patrol schedule had said 40 minutes. The first QF came over the ridge in 12. Marcus had the rifle up before he consciously decided to raise it, the training of a previous life operating faster than thought, and he was tracking the QF's approach and doing math at the same time. Range, 300 meters in closing. Speed, approximately double a running human, which was consistent with everything he'd observed. Time to contact, 60 seconds if it maintained course and pace. 2 more appeared behind the first. Run, he said. Lena was already running. Kai was already running. Marcus held position for 3 more seconds, long enough for the Keth to register him as the threat rather than the 2 figures moving toward the boat, long enough to be certain they were tracking him, and then he ran too, angling left, toward the cliff edge, where the rock broke into a series of ledges that might slow them down if the ledges slowed the Keth at all, which was something he didn't know for certain. He was fast for his age and condition, which wasn't fast enough. The first Keth covered the distance between them in what his body registered as not enough time, and his mind registered as approximately 40 seconds, which meant they were substantially faster than he'd estimated. He felt the electromagnetic pressure before he felt anything physical, that pushing quality, like walking against a strong wind that wasn't there. The field effect that some researchers had theorized was an offensive weapon, and others had theorized was simply proximity artifact, and which Marcus had never had reason to test at close range. He reached the cliff edge. Below was a 4-meter drop to a ledge, then water. He jumped without stopping to think about it. The drop hit his knees and rolled through his hip, and he came up moving, rifle still in hand by some miracle of grip, scrambling across the ledge toward the boat where Lena and Kai were already in the water, pushing the hull off the rocks. He hit the water, and it was cold enough to function as a shock to the system that reset everything. Cleared the adrenaline interference, sharpened the focus, and he grabbed the bow and pulled himself aboard. And they were moving before he was fully in, the motor catching on the second pull, Kai at the tiller and Lena in the bow, and Marcus in the middle finding his feet. The Keth did not follow into the water. He'd noted that before, in the first months, they avoided deep water, or at least the deep water near this coast, in a way that suggested either aversion or inability. He didn't know which. He didn't need to know. He needed them to not follow, and they were not following. They ran south with the motor at full capacity, which was loud, which was a risk, but the risk of the Keth at the cliff edge was larger than the risk of the noise. And Marcus had been doing this math for 3 years. Lena was watching the headland behind them. The Keth had stopped at the cliff edge. 3 of them, visible in the darkness only by their bioluminescence, which was doing the agitated, rapid pulse thing that Marcus had seen exactly once before, 3 years ago when a Keth near Bergen had been struck by what appeared to be a falling piece of aircraft debris, and had just stood there in the middle of the road doing the rapid pulse for 11 minutes before resuming its patrol. Distress signal, he'd thought then. Some kind of distress signal. Now, he thought, they don't know what just happened. They've arrived at the column, and they don't know what's wrong with it. They have no protocol for this, because this has never happened before. The composite frames were still deployed around the column base. The column was still pulsing erratically. Somewhere in the network, other nodes were still receiving that noise and propagating it. They made the island before dawn. Marcus sat on the dock for a long time afterward, while Lena and Kai secured the boat and cleaned the gear and did the ordinary practical things that ordinary life requires, and he thought about the physicist in Trondheim who had 12 hours of data and died before he could analyze it, and about all the researchers who had made educated guesses, and about a mute boy who had spent 5 months alone working on a problem that the remaining governments of the world, what remained of them, had been throwing resources at for 3 years without visible progress. The difference, Marcus thought, was that Kai had no institution to constrain him, no prior framework to defend, no funding to justify. He had only the problem and the time to sit with it, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told, repeatedly and in various ways, that they couldn't communicate what they were thinking. He heard footsteps on the dock, and Lena sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders were touching, which was something she did now that she hadn't done in the first years, not from distance, but from the conserved energy of survival, which gives you exactly what's required and nothing more. The fact that she was touching his shoulder in the early morning light on a dock on an island in a world that had tried very hard to destroy them was, he thought, evidence of something. He wasn't sure yet what. The column, she said. It was still disrupted when we left. Yes. Is it still disrupted now? I don't know. What happens if the disruption spreads? He thought about it carefully. I don't know that either. I have a hypothesis. Tell me, if the network degrades enough, if enough nodes are producing interference rather than signal, the Keth lose their spatial map. They lose their communication structure. They've been operating with complete electromagnetic situational awareness since they arrived. They've never had to function without it. We don't know what they do when they lose it. He paused. We don't know if they become more dangerous or less. Lena was quiet for a moment, then, Kai thinks less. Kai may be right. You have doubts. I always have doubts. Doubts are the thing that keeps you from being wrong in a way that kills you. She was quiet again, and then she said something he hadn't heard her say in a very long time. Are we going to be okay? It was the question she'd asked constantly in the first year. Every morning, almost, in the cabin of the first safe house before they'd found the island, while Marcus was making the thin soup that was all they had and thinking about the next move and the move after that. Are we going to be okay? He'd answered yes, always yes, with the certainty that fathers are expected to provide. The certainty that he'd known even then wasn't quite honest, and she'd known it too, and they'd maintained the mutual fiction because it was necessary. He thought about telling her yes now. He didn't. I don't know, he said, but we have a chance we didn't have yesterday. That's real. She sat with that for a moment, and then she nodded, and it was the nod of someone who has grown up enough to prefer the truth to the comfort, which is not a thing that happens overnight. Kai appeared at the dock's edge, notebook in hand. He'd been listening. He wrote something and held it up. There is more material. We have enough for 7 columns. Marcus looked at him, looked at his daughter, looked at the water, which was catching the first light now, the gray going silver, the silver going something warmer. 7 columns. 17 columns across the network that Marcus had mapped from his observations and his reading, and the incomplete data sets he'd assembled from, memory and stolen papers. 7 out of 17 wasn't a majority, wasn't a decisive proportion. But 7 introduced into a network that had never experienced interference was not 7 independent disruptions. It was 7 nodes of noise, propagating into a connected system, multiplying as they went, each node's interference becoming another node's input, and that node's distortion becoming signal to the next. The math was possible. The math was genuinely possible. He looked at the notebook in Kai's hand, at the notebook that had been the only communication Kai had for however long he'd been alone before the hospital, at the small, precise handwriting that had explained physics to him over a kitchen table, and proposed an approach that the remaining governments of the world had not conceived of. Probably because the remaining governments of the world were thinking about weapons and territory and the kind of solutions that worked against human enemies. 7 columns, Marcus said. We'll need a plan for each one. Timing matters. We'd want to deploy them simultaneously, or close enough to simultaneous that the network can't respond to the first disruption before the others are in place. Kai was already writing. We'll need people, Lena said. We can't do 7 simultaneously with 3. We'll need people, Marcus agreed. There are people, she said. There are people on the mainland. We've seen signs of them. Yes, they need to know this is possible. They need to know it worked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about the life they'd built here, the island's safety, the island's invisibility. The risk of reaching out to others had always been calibrated against the value of isolation. Every person you involved was a potential security breach, a potential trail leading back to the one place they absolutely could not afford to lose. The island had been a reasonable trade-off when all they had was survival. It was a less reasonable trade-off now. Kai was watching him. Lena was watching him. They were both doing the thing they'd learned to do, both of them, giving him the space to reason without filling it with pressure. They'd trust his conclusion when he reached it. He knew that, and he knew something else, which was that the trust was itself a kind of pressure, the pressure of being responsible for people who are counting on you to reason well. He thought about the physicist in Trondheim. He thought about all the people who'd had pieces of this and died before they could fit them together. He thought about a mute boy who had 5 months of thinking and no one to think it with, and the waste of that, the particular waste of the human mind working alone when it was built to work in aggregate. We go to the mainland, he said. We make contact. Carefully. With people who've survived 3 years, they know how to be careful. Lena exhaled. Kai wrote something and held it up. I know where some of them are. Marcus looked at him. Of course he did. Kai had been alone on the mainland for how long? At least a year by Marcus's estimate, probably longer. A mute boy navigating the ruins of civilization, learning things by necessity, building knowledge out of isolation the way a plant builds itself out of poor soil. He knew where people were. He'd watched them from a distance for the same reason Marcus had watched them, because the caution of approach in this world was not paranoia, but professionalism. Show me, Marcus said. They spent 3 days preparing maps, organizing the material, building a communication plan that didn't rely on any electronic infrastructure they couldn't trust. Kai drew maps from memory of the mainland settlements he'd identified. 4 locations, ranging from small family groups to what sounded, from his notes, like an organized community of perhaps 30 people sheltering in a former school building on the coast. 30 people with 30 different sets of knowledge and skill and capacity, none of which would individually be sufficient, all of which together might be. On the morning of the 4th day, Marcus went to the mainland alone for the first approach. He took his notebook. He took his maps. He took the story of the column, and what had happened to it, and the physics behind it, distilled to its simplest form. Not simple, because it wasn't complex, but simplified to the terms that would let someone make a decision about whether to believe it and whether to act. He found the school building where Kai had said it would be. He found the sentries where Kai had said they'd be, one on the roof, one at the ground entrance, one in the shadow of the gymnasium that you'd only know about if you'd been watching for 3 weeks. He approached the ground entrance with his hands visible and his rifle on his back with the barrel pointing down, which was the internationally recognized gesture, for I am not currently in combat mode. Interpret this as you will. The sentry was a woman, perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had been a certain kind of person before and had remained that person despite everything, which was, Marcus thought, the best you could hope for. He told her what he had. She listened. She said, "Show me the physics." He showed her the physics. She said, "Give me 2 days." He gave her 2 days. When he came back, she had 8 people with her and a list of questions that demonstrated that, whatever this community had lost in 3 years, access to careful thinking wasn't among them. He answered the questions. Kai's notebook passed between them. He'd sent it with Marcus as evidence, as documentation, as the physical object of a mind working, and they read it with the attention it deserved. On the 7th day, they had a plan. 12 people total, including Marcus and Lena and Kai, enough to deploy to 7 columns simultaneously. The timing required a synchronization method that didn't rely on electronics, which Kai had solved with a mechanical timer system and a set of pre-agreed positions based on astronomical events. The approach of dawn, the movement of specific stars, the kind of navigation that humans had been using for millennia before they'd had anything else, and could use again, now. The night they chose came 3 weeks later. The columns were spread across a 70-kilometer radius. Each team of 2 had a column and a deployment frame built to Kai's specifications and a timed trigger set to deploy within 30 seconds, astronomical midnight. They'd rehearsed the deployment until the movements were reflex. They'd mapped their exit routes with the care of people who understood that the plan that works is the one that accounts for what happens when it doesn't work. Marcus stood at the column nearest the island, column 12, which was the one he'd watched for the longest and knew the most intimately, with Lena beside him, and he thought about the physicist in Trondheim one more time, who had written in his last broadcast, "The information density in their communication medium exceeds anything in our theoretical models. We are dealing with something that uses physics we don't have names for. But physics we don't have names for is not physics we can't affect." The mechanical timer reached its mark. 12 frames deployed in the same second, one after another across a 70-kilometer arc, the sound like a sequence of books closing, a library being put to rest. The columns began to stutter, all of them, all at once, the pulse rhythm breaking into interference, the blue-white luminescence going uncertain and then arrhythmic and then frankly chaotic, the patterns that had pulsed with mechanical certainty for 3 years going suddenly, completely wrong. In the network between them, the noise was multiplying. Marcus stood at column 12 and watched it stutter and felt the electromagnetic pressure change. The field was still strong, but its character had changed. Gone from a voice speaking clearly to a voice trying to speak through static, the information dissolving into the carrier wave, the message becoming the medium's malfunction. He didn't know what would happen next. He knew that this was the first day in 3 years that the Keth's network had not been functioning, and that the people who'd done that were 12 humans with mechanical timers and salvage composite material, and a theory developed by a boy who couldn't be thought. There will be a response. There will be a reaction. The Keth are not passive, and what we've done tonight is not invisible to them. He thought, we will deal with that when it comes. He thought, with the exhausted clarity of someone who has been running on fear and necessity for 3 years, and has found something that might be different. This is what it means to fight back. Not with weapons we don't have against an enemy we can't outmatch by force. With the thing we have. With the thing we've always had. The particular stubborn, aggregate intelligence of human beings who are cornered and refuse, on principle, to stay cornered. Lena took his hand in the dark, not to comfort him, not from fear. Just here, now this, the 2 of them on a headland in the Scandinavian night with the stars doing what stars do and the columns going wrong for the first time and future opening in a direction that had been closed for 3 years. He took her hand back. Kai was 30 meters away at his position, and Marcus couldn't see his expression in the dark. But he could see that Kai had not moved, was standing completely still in the way he sometimes stood, notebook not in hand, nothing being written, just the boy himself and the night, And what he'd thought about for 5 months is finally actually happening. The columns pulsed erratically. The network carried noise. Somewhere along the coast, in the other positions, 11 other people stood and watched and breathed and waited for the next thing. They were still here. They were, in all the ways that matter, still here. The morning came the way mornings come, without asking permission, without apology for its timing. The sky went gray, and then pink, and then the pale gold of a northern summer, and the column 12 meters from Marcus was still pulsing but wrong. Still wrong, and the air smelled of ozone and sea salt, and something else that he couldn't identify immediately, and then he could. Green things. Growing things. The smell of the island's vegetation in the morning wind, the smell of the world that persisted underneath everything, the soil that was still soil, the plants that were still plants, the water that was still water, doing what they'd always done regardless of what the sky above them held. Kai was beside him now, and Lena on his other side, and they were all three watching the column, and the column was doing something it had never done in Marcus's observation. It was dimming, not shutting off. He doubted it was capable of shutting off, but dimming, the blue-white going cooler, the pulse lengthening, the frequency dropping. The network's attempt to correct the interference was itself becoming part of the interference. It would not last forever. The Keth would adapt. The Keth would respond. The Keth had resources and capabilities that 3 humans and 12 people with mechanical timers could not match in any sustained conventional conflict. But they had started something. They had demonstrated that the system could be disrupted, that the network could be interfered with, that the physics could be bent in ways the Keth had apparently not anticipated, because they had not planned for humans to discover the mechanism. And this was the Keth's mistake, if it could be called a mistake. They had not accounted for the particular quality of a creature that reads physics papers, and keeps notes and talks to a mute boy over a kitchen table and asks the question, what can we actually do? And keeps asking it until an answer emerges. They'd underestimated the aggregate. They'd come for the planet and stepped past the people, and the people had been paying attention. Marcus looked at Kai. Kai was already writing. He held up the notebook in the growing light. 17 columns. We have enough material. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the column and the column's wrong pulse, and the coast beyond it and the mainland beyond that, where 11 people were standing at their own positions, watching their own wrong pulsing columns and waiting for what came next. Yes, he said. We do. He took the notebook from Kai gently and turned to a fresh page and wrote something of his own and handed it back. Kai read it. A small, surprised expression crossed his face. The expression of someone who has been named correctly after a long time of not being named at all. Marcus had written, "Good work, Kai. Now we find out what comes after." What came after was a different story, longer and harder and stranger than what had come before. Full of things Marcus couldn't have predicted from the headland that morning, and wouldn't have wanted to miss. But that morning, in the gold light with the columns pulsing wrong and the world smelling of green things, was where it started. Where it started was with a father who would not lie to his daughter about the red lines climbing her leg, with a boy who could not speak but could think, with a woman by a school entrance who had said, "Show me the physics," the most human thing anyone had said in 3 years. Where it started was with people who refused, on principle, to stop being people. The column pulsed. They watched it. It pulsed wrong, and that was enough. The first contact was made through Kai's notebook. Marcus had not expected it to work as cleanly as it did. In his experience, nothing that depended on people behaving reasonably worked as cleanly as it should. But the woman from the school building, whose name was Elena, and whose previous life had involved something technical that she was deliberately vague about, read Kai's notes with the attention of someone who was not reading to confirm what they already believed. She read to understand. When she disagreed with a calculation, she said so, wrote her objection, and Kai corrected or defended with equal bluntness. Marcus watched them work across the kitchen table and thought, this is what we were for. The species, the entire complicated mess of it. Not the wars, not the hierarchies, not the systems of control that had organized so much of what humans had built. This, 2 minds at a table, arguing about physics, neither willing to be wrong and both willing to be corrected. The aliens had stepped over this when they planted their columns along the fault lines. They had stepped over the most dangerous thing on the planet and not noticed. Because it was small, because it was quiet, because it looked like nothing. Elena brought 3 people with her the second visit. A man who'd been a structural engineer, a teenager who'd been teaching herself electronics from salvaged manuals, a former paramedic who had no relevant technical knowledge, but who had the quality Marcus valued most after intelligence, which was the capacity to stay calm when the situation deteriorated. You could always use someone who stayed calm when things went wrong. The engineer's name was Dario, and he looked at the deployment frames Marcus had built with the expression of a man trying hard not to explain how they could be improved. Marcus told him to please explain how they could be improved. Dario improved them. The improved frames were lighter, sturdier, and deployed 30% faster, which meant the window needed for deployment dropped from 4 minutes to under 3. The electronics teenager, whose name was Saul, and who communicated primarily in a form of sarcastic shorthand that required calibration to interpret, looked at Kai's trigger mechanism and made 3 changes that Kai approved of by writing correct, yes, yes, in rapid succession, which Marcus had learned was Kai's version of enthusiasm. The paramedic's name was Bertrand, and he spent his first visit simply walking the island, examining its layout and defenses and medical supplies and food stores, and came back with a quiet, thorough assessment of what they had and what they were short on, and suggestions for each shortage that were, without exception, things that could actually be found, practical, specific, actionable. Marcus liked him immediately. They were 5 weeks from the night of the first column deployment, when they found the second group 60 kilometers north, by way of a signal Kai had noticed 3 months ago and flagged in his notebook without having the means to respond to. It was a pattern in the cormorant behavior, not a human using the birds as a signal, but a human whose daily patterns were causing the birds to behave in a regular way that differed from the natural rhythm. Cormorants, Kai had written, are honest. They respond to what is actually there. If a person moves through an area at the same time every morning, the cormorants record it. Marcus had read that entry 4 times when Kai first showed it to him. Then he'd looked at the window, at the birds on the dock post, and thought about all the things he was doing every day that were being recorded by cormorants somewhere. The second group was larger, 42 people in a fortified compound on a small peninsula, with a former military officer who had maintained something close to discipline, and a former biologist who had been studying the Keth's field effects from concealment, and whose data, when Marcus saw it, added 3 new dimensions to Kai's model. The biologist's name was Marin, and she was precise in a way that made Marcus feel imprecise, which he respected. She went through Kai's calculations with a red pen, an actual red pen, which she produced from somewhere with the air of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to use it, and marked corrections and questions, and in 3 places wrote elegant in the margin in a way that suggested she didn't use that word carelessly. She confirmed the fundamental mechanism. She added the detail that the network operated on a feedback principle. The columns didn't just broadcast, they listened to each other's broadcasts and adjusted, maintaining coherence through constant mutual calibration. This meant that disrupting a node didn't just introduce noise into its output, it disrupted the calibration of every node that was using it as a reference point. 7 nodes, simultaneously disrupted, would be using each other as references for their disruption. The interference would propagate and compound in a way that Kai had intuited from first, principles, but that Marin could now model mathematically. They ran the model 3 times, adjusting parameters, and all 3 runs produced the same result. 17 columns disrupted in under 4 minutes of propagation time. 4 minutes. The Keth network, which had operated without interruption for 3 years, would go from fully functional to fully disrupted in approximately the time it took to boil water. Marcus sat with that number for a long time. They had 17 targets identified. They had the material for all 17. They had, between the island group and Elena's community and the peninsula compound, 51 people who understood the plan and could execute their part of it, and had the particular quality that 3 years of survival confers, which is not bravery in the conventional sense, but something quieter. The habit of doing the necessary thing, because the necessary thing is what you do. The plan required simultaneous deployment at all 17 columns. The synchronization problem, which had seemed in the early weeks like the most intractable constraint, had been solved by Kai and Sol working together in a collaboration that produced 3 days of very fast notebook passing and 1 memorable afternoon where they both sat in complete silence for 2 hours staring at the ceiling, and then simultaneously turned to their respective work surfaces and began writing. The solution was mechanical and astronomical and simple enough that Marcus had felt, on hearing it, the particular deflation of a problem that was obviously solvable once you saw how. The timers were set relative to a specific stellar transit, The moment a particular star cleared a particular horizon feature that was visible from all 17 positions, the timer started at the same cosmic moment for everyone. The deployment happened on a count that was calibrated to the transit timing, which was accurate to within seconds across any distance. Stars didn't need a working network. Stars were reliable in a way that nothing human-made had been for 3 years. On the night before the deployment, Marcus sat with Lena on the south-facing slope, and they were quiet for a long time, in the way that people are quiet when there's too much to say to start anywhere. The infection in her leg was fully resolved. She moved easily, ran when they drilled, had been carrying frames and materials for 3 weeks, without complaint or limitation. She was physically the person she'd been before the cut, and more. The weeks of recovery had given her time to sit with Kai's calculations, to work through the physics herself, to understand not just what they were doing, but why it would work. If it doesn't work, she said finally, not as a preface to fear, but as a continuation of thought, we still demonstrated something. Yes, that the mechanism is real, that the network can be disrupted, even if not at the scale we're attempting. Yes, so even if it fails tonight, the information exists. Marin has the data. Sol has the electronics documentation. The next attempt has more to build on. Marcus looked at her. She'd turned into something in the years, in the months. He'd watched it happen and still couldn't entirely account for it. The shift from the child who'd looked at his face to know how afraid to be, to the person beside him now who was reasoning about failure modes and information preservation with the calm of a scientist. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. She nodded. Then I think it's going to work. So do I. They sat with that and with the stars overhead, and with the fact that tomorrow night, those stars would be the synchronization signal for 51 people spread across 70 kilometers of coastline, and with the knowledge that the thing they were attempting had never been attempted and would either change something fundamental about the next 3 years or confirm that it could be done, and therefore would be done. Marcus thought about the 17 columns and the network between them. He thought about the physicist who had 12 hours of data. He thought about the particular loneliness of Kai's 5 months with a notebook and a theory, and no one to test it against, and the way that loneliness had ended at a hospital pharmacy on a gray morning that had started like all the other gray mornings and turned into something else. He thought that the Kieth had been very thorough. They'd assessed the planet, identified what they needed, deployed their infrastructure, managed the population reduction, with an efficiency that had not involved malice because it hadn't needed to. They'd been thorough, but they'd done their assessment at the wrong level. They'd looked at the species technology, which was outmatched. They'd looked at the species organization, which was dismantled. They hadn't looked at what happened in kitchens and on docks and in ruined hospitals when individuals compared notes with. They hadn't accounted for the notebook. That thought made Marcus almost smile, which was a thing he still wasn't entirely used to. He'd been doing it more in the last 2 months than in the previous 3 years. The transit time was 2:44 a.m. At 2:43, Marcus was at column 12 with Lena. The frame was set, the trigger was in his hand, and the night was quiet except for the wind and the column's pulse and the cormorants on the nearby rocks who had gone very still. The star cleared the horizon. Marcus counted to the mark. He pulled the trigger, and everywhere along the coast, 51 people did the same thing at the same time for the same reason, which was that they'd looked at what they had and decided it was enough. The columns went wrong all at once. All 17 of them, the pulse rhythm fracturing simultaneously, the network trying to respond to 17 simultaneous disruptions with a calibration system that was using the disrupted nodes as its reference points. The interference compounding as Marin's model had said it would, the blue-white luminescence going chaotic and then dimmer and then strange in a way that had no precedent. The Keth across the coast began their rapid pulse distress response. All of them simultaneously. Whatever they were saying to each other in that light, Marcus didn't know and would probably never know. He watched column 12 go dim in the gray pre-dawn, and he listened to the world, and it was quiet, in a way it hadn't been since before the columns went up. The particular quality of that low-frequency pulse gone from the air, the pressure behind the eyes lifting, the back teeth no longer registering something below hearing. Lena was beside him. She exhaled slowly. "There it is," she said. There it was. Marcus looked north along the coast where he couldn't see the other positions but knew they were there, knew that at each one a person was standing in the pre-dawn and watching their column pulse wrong, and feeling the same thing, which was not triumph exactly. Triumph was for after, when you knew the result. But something simpler and more durable, the knowledge that they'd been right. The deployment had been exact. The mechanism was real. The network was disrupted. Whatever came next, and things would come next because nothing in 3 years had ever stayed resolved for long, they had demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated. The physics worked. The humans had read the physics correctly. The network could be broken. The next steps were harder. The Keth would respond. The response would require responses of its own. There were 17 columns dealt with, and Marcus's maps showed 33 more that he knew of, and what Marin's data suggested about the network's redundancy meant that they hadn't brought it down, only wounded it, only shown the wound was possible. But there was a group now. There was Kai's notebook and Maren's data and Sol's electronics and Bertrand's calm and Elena's precision and Dario's better frames. There was Lena with the physics in her head and 3 years of learning to move through a world that was trying to kill them. There was the Peninsula compound with its military structure and its biologists' notes. There was the school community with its SATE people who'd shown up at a second meeting with questions. There was Kai, who stood at his column position on the southern headland and had watched 17 columns pulse wrong, and who was... Marcus was certain from the way he'd watched Kai work for 2 months. Already thinking about what came next, Marcus took one last look at column 12. It was pulsing in long, slow, arrhythmic intervals now, the light faint and wrong, and doing nothing useful for the network it was supposed to serve. He turned and walked back to where Lena was waiting, and they went to find the boat, and they went back to the island, and the morning came and was gold and green and smelled of the sea. Later, weeks later, in a larger kitchen at the school building with 12 people around a table covered in maps and notebooks and Marin's data, printouts and Sol's circuit diagrams, Marcus would try to identify the moment when it changed, when it stopped being survival and became something else. He'd keep coming back to the hospital pharmacy, the dim corridor, a boy trying very hard not to be heard. 2 people who needed the same thing for different reasons, moving toward the same cabinet. That was it. Not the columns, not the deployment, not the physics. 2 people in a ruined building, both looking for what the world had left that could still help. That was where it started. That was the whole story, really, reduced to its simplest terms. People find each other, and finding each other is the beginning of everything. Kai was at the table, writing. He wrote constantly now, had 3 notebooks in simultaneous use, and the writing had a different quality than it had on the island, faster, more confident, because there were people to write to, people who read it and wrote back, people who argued and extended and questioned and built on. The isolation had been the constraint. 51 people was the beginning of scale. He looked up at some point and found Marcus watching him. He wrote something and slid it across the table. It said, "Thank you for the antibiotic." Marcus read it twice. Then he wrote back, "Thank you for the physics." Kai made the so-so gesture with his hand, which Marcus had come to understand meant partial credit, more accurately attributed elsewhere. Then Kai wrote one more thing and slid it back. It said, "What do we do about the other 33 columns?" Marcus looked at the map on the table, at the marks Marin had added to his original survey, at the geometric pattern of the energy column networks spread across the Norwegian coast, and the implications of that pattern for what the Keth were, drawing out of the planet's magnetic field, and what disrupting 33 more nodes would do to the drawing. He looked at the 12 people at the table, and the 20 in the corridor, and the 39 at the Peninsula compound who'd sent representatives and data and committed to the next phase. He picked up his pen. He wrote, one at a time, and that was enough to begin.